Thank you. Good afternoon. Before we start the meeting, I'd like to go around the table, please, so everyone can introduce themselves, as we are sort of a new committee and we do have substitutions. So we can start with you first, Sarah.
Yeah, I'm Sarah Townsend and I'm the committee officer and clerk to the meeting.
Roger Evans, elected member for the London division.
Julian Dean, councillor for Port Hill.
Rosemary Dartnell, councillor for Baston Hill, Colham and Sutton.
That type, similarly to me, primarily for Baston Hill, but also for Sutton and Andrew. Hope to go on our own shortly. Yeah.
Right.
Royal Croft, Market Rate Lease, War and Northern House.
Laura Fisher, Head of Housing Resettlement and Independent Living. And Jane Trakiri, Assistant Director, Homes and Communities.
Joyce Barrow, Chair of this committee.
Tom Dodd, Scrutiny Manager.
Nick Hickman, councillor for Ray Valley.
Peggy Mullock, Whitchurch North.
Paul Wynne, Priest Ward. Rob Wilson, Copthorne.
Thank you. Okay, we'll start the meeting. Good afternoon. Welcome to this meeting of the Economy and Environment Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I am obliged to inform you that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded. Members of the public will be able to view the meeting using the link on the agenda. We'll move to item number 1 now, which is apologies for absence. We have apologies from Councillor Gary Burchett, that he's being substituted by Councillor Peggy Mullock. Councillor Steve Davenport is being substituted by Councillor Roy Aldcroft. And Councillor Pam Mosley is being substituted by Councillor Ted Clark. Thank you. Item 2, disposable interest. Members are... Sorry, shall I come in there, Roger? Or...
I've got a registrable interest.
Okay, I'll just read this. Members are reminded that they must declare their disposable pecuniary interest and other registrable or non-registrable interests in any matter being considered at the meeting, as set out in Appendix B of the Members' Code of Conduct, and consider if they should leave the room prior to the item being discussed. Roger.
Thank you, Chairman. It is a non-pecuniary interest, but I am a member of a Shropshire Rural Housing Association, which is a provider of houses.
Okay, thank you very much. Julian?
Yeah, so I do have pecuniary interest in the sense that part of this discussion around housing relates to temporary lets, and my former property is a temporary let.
Okay, thank you. Any other? No? Okay, we'll move on to item 3, which are the minutes of previous meetings. So we're going to consider the minutes of the following previous meetings. The Economy and Environment Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting held on the 11th of May 2023. Does anybody have any issues or anything they wish to pick up on them? No? Would anybody like to move those minutes? Please?
Yeah, move.
Well, we've got Roger and seconded by Julian. We'd have been here all day otherwise. Now, Place Overview Committee meeting held on the 23rd of March 2023. So that will be the older committee members. Would you like to move them, Paul? Paul Wynne, and seconded by Roy Aldcroft. We'll move it down today. Thank you. And we're now going to look at the Communities Overview Committee meeting held on the 22nd of March 2023. Does anybody wish to pick anything up on those? No? Can somebody move the minutes? I will move the minutes. Would somebody second the minutes? I'll second them. Paul Wynne. Thank you very much. With that, we're going to move on to item 4. Public question time. We have had none. Item 5. Unusually, no member questions this time. And we are now moving on to the meat of the meeting. That sounds funny, doesn't it? Meat of the meeting. Social housing and reviewing the housing strategy. And Tom Dobbs is going to present the report. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Chair. So we've got a presentation
Mel's going to pop up on, and we'll work through it. The presentation is really just taking you through the report at a very high level. You've had the report. We're not going to go through it in detail. And really, it's a chance for you as a committee to discuss this report. So, I suppose a quick bit in terms of the background to the report. So, Mel, do you want to move on to slide 3? That's it. So it's just sort of like say, so under Communities Overview Committee, so this is where this started. This topic or topics around social housing has been through that committee and recognised in that committee. So March 2022, as you can see on there, they were looking at understanding more about social housing stock in Shropshire. By the end of 2022, so December sort of time, there was a view about the need to actually look at social housing in a bit more detail, and actually, timing-wise, that seemed to fit very well with a review of the housing strategy and bringing that up to date. So, really, an opportunity for what was the Communities Overview Committee, but now this committee, to have input into that strategy and that pre-decision sort of scrutiny way of working. So the committee designed its work over around 3 core meetings. So the first meeting, do you want to move on to the next slide, Mel? So what the 3 so around that, it was done. First meeting very much was based around recognising the role of the registered providers or social landlords, as you might know them, in terms of providing social housing in Shropshire. So I think it's quite a high percentage, around about 80%, something like that, is of social housing is provided through the registered providers, with the remaining really being provided through Star Housing, the council's provider as well. So that first meeting was about hearing from those chief executives from the main social landlords in the county, plus also input from council officers as well. The second session, which you just for the minutes of, was a session that was very much structured around the data, background information, understanding the needs around social housing. There's a link from the report to that paper, but very much things like recognising demographic change and impact of demographic change, socio-economic factors, so looking at the types of jobs and employment, looking at where we have different housing in the county. So that was a really good session that explored a lot of that information, and then informed really the shape of the workshop and the questions which we're considering in the workshop, and we can cover those in a bit more detail in the slides. But the workshop session was attended, and I can by a number of members actually who were in the room and contributed to that conversation. Do you want to go to the next slide, Mel? I need to catch up. Okay, so in terms of, I suppose, high-level learning from the meetings which took place, the first one there was about developing social housing and the availability of land. The chief executives, we've mentioned it in the report, the chief executives of the social providers were quite clear that if you want to develop social housing, you are looking at making sure you've got the right land in the right place at the right price. You are looking to make sure that you can develop those properties where they're going to be required, but also you know, as a developer, that anybody would be looking to make sure that it's not being done at a higher cost. I suppose it's fairly self-explanatory. In terms of looking at affordable housing contributions, so this is through our planning policy and what our starting point as a council in terms of what we require taking place in housing development, certainly major housing development with a higher number of properties. I think the position in the planning guidance is about 10%. Our local position is somewhere between 10 and 20%, but there were local authorities from some benchmarking exercises like South Staffordshire Housing, where they asked for 40% of any development being sort of affordable housing from that perspective. And I think the question which came through really for members when they were looking at this was, from a negotiation perspective and position, where's the best position to start from for making sure you've got enough social housing balanced with where are you going to make sure that you've got the right level or requirement in there that doesn't put off developers wanting to sort of look at the area as something to come to. So that was quite a strong view that came through in that consideration. Interestingly, terminology was another big piece of learning in this. So I think the general perspective, the two main areas. One was around affordable housing. What do we mean by affordable housing? The other was around the term homelessness. What do we mean by homelessness? I think with homelessness, or within that, there are phrases like sofa surfing, temporary accommodation, so the bed and breakfast use of hotels, families, and certainly the impact through the pandemic and the cost of living. Laura's here, should be far better than me to be able to explain some of this. But there was a recognition that when people normally hear the term homelessness, the first thing they think about is people rustling, people being on the street or needing to go into a shelter, not necessarily the wider term and the term as it's used when we're talking about social housing and the housing need as well. The other bit on social or affordable housing is it's being used increasingly as a global term. What affordable housing is, but actually it covers a broad church, and often people think affordable housing means the same as social housing. Affordable housing can be a whole range of other factors, which is why the terms of reference of this piece of work was very much social housing and the role social housing plays in the county rather than affordable housing. But the reason we have almost a glossary of terms as part of the paper in the appendix is because it was, it's that. How do we start to make that clearer through this? So again, from the work of the members and the observations of the members who are involved, that was certainly a feature as well. And finally, it's a bullet that came through very strongly in the conversations at the workshop as well, in terms of the housing market and the changing socio and economic environment. Over the last few years, it certainly has been in the national press about the impacts on the private rented sector, in terms of demand, cost of rent, other factors as well playing into that. Maybe with mortgages changing, are people looking at selling the properties that they rent out? It's having an impact on the housing market nationally, and I think probably locally as well, in terms of if you take capacity or you increase the prices in the private rental sector, it can drive demand in the affordable housing and therefore the social sector as well. So those are all some of the main learning points which came through from the meetings. Mel, do you want to pick up or run to the next one, please? So again, on the workshop session, these are the questions. So there were 4 questions that came out of that earlier piece of work that the committee did in March, looking at around housing needs. So first one, well rehearsed for Shropshire. We are getting older here. How can we help and support people to plan for the future, including homes that they would like to live in and homes that will meet their needs as well. Good examples around that, I guess, are when you start to look at things like people being discharged from hospital, and we're talking very much about the virtual wards, and you as local members, I've heard local members talking to me about people in their communities who experience being discharged from hospital, and they haven't got all the adaptations in the property, or the property hasn't got the room for them to be able to have access to move around. So that was very much reflected in that question. Rural areas, a strong sense from that session in March from members was that our rural areas really becoming places, only those who can afford to can live there. So part of the conversation in the workshop was very much exploring what those reasons were. How can housing be promoted as a driver for economic success in Shropshire? So very strongly in those conversations, there were links being made to the types of economy and demand in certain areas, and types of housing which were in those areas, or had easy access to those areas, but also in terms of actually, when you look at our communities in Shropshire, one of the things which has come through the conversations quite strongly is the need for there to be sustainable and balanced communities. You need to make sure that you probably have a good mix of social housing in there. The examples that came through in the workshop are very much, for example, around communities where you have a higher older population, where there's potentially a growing need for domiciliary care support. Domiciliary care workers can't afford to live in that community and have to travel in from quite some distance away. Where, how can you make that community more sustainable and have a better environmental impact from that perspective? And then finally, looking at those better supported housing options in those sort of community areas. Very much about how do you make sure that vulnerable people are able to live in the communities they want to live in, and how can that be developed and done. So those are the 4 main questions from the workshop on the 5th of June. Do you want to roll through now? Again, I'm not going to go into massive detail. A lot of this is in the report as well. But again, long-standing challenge for Shropshire, in particular, over a number of years, until I've been here for far too long. But how do you retain younger people in Shropshire, and particularly in rural areas? And in this instance, what's the role of housing and available housing in those communities so that people can live there, and link that to the right kind of employment as well, or access to employment. So that could be transport infrastructure, for example. The first 2, I think, are very, very much linked as well. It's the same broad view about what's genuinely affordable housing, whether that's private rented, genuinely affordable housing, or what's genuinely affordable from the sense of social housing as well. So that came through very strongly about how can that be made to a clear focus, and also how can you look at taking account of not just a nationally set view and definition, but how to take account of local salary and local wages as part of that. What's locally affordable as well. In terms of vulnerable people in independent and rural areas, one of the bits, this very much tied back into that bit about carers as well. So how can you help people to be more independent? Is there sufficient access to technology and the infrastructure supports the technology, which we know will be covered? And to be honest, some of this links across into work that other committees will be doing over the coming 12 months, other committees will be doing in the coming 12 months. But from a social housing perspective, have we got the right houses in the right places, that the right people can stay, which will help in those areas? But linked to that, have we got houses with the right connectivity in the right places that people can use to be there? Or lifetime homes that they have got the wheelchair access, all the plugs and different things in the right places as well. Another bit there in terms of housing options for older people. So quite a lot of conversation around what do older people want, what would be attractive to older people. Have we got older people who are in their own homes or in social housing where maybe they're 3-bed properties and then 2-bed property? Is there a way that they can be helped to do that? Is there a way that properties can be converted so that we can maybe turn a garage space more easily into a room that other family members could live in and be part of the home as well? We touched on assistive technology. The other conversation really much was around the handy person scheme and promoting and extending that handy person scheme so it's more widely accessible and perhaps not primarily focused at those people who are known to the council needing social care or on the edge of social care as well. In terms of promoting the importance of housing to the economy, this was very much sort of picking up on this being clearer, or being able to be clearer about that relationship between jobs and the economy and where houses are. If you want to develop jobs in certain places, how do people get to those jobs? The other part of that, which we touched on briefly with the other slide there, is about, we know there are communities who will be less willing or less keen on having affordable housing or social housing developed in those areas. How do we make sure through the housing strategy and through conversations with planning policy and economic growth that those links and benefits and opportunities are explored? And then finally, that last bit there is, again, came through very strongly in one of the groups in particular, or one of the discussions at the tables and workshop, was around how to ensure that housing strategy as a function, not just the housing strategy as a document, has got strong relationships with an ability to influence and work with planning policy and economic growth. So those are very much tied together. And though it's not on the slides, that's a very much a relationship between a housing strategy, the economic growth strategy, transport strategies and transport plans as they come up, these need to be working together as a system. They cannot function independently of each other. Okay, Mel, do you want to go on to the next slide? So this is the last slide. You'd be pleased to know, more or less.
There's a drink of water.
Recommendations then for this. So one of the bits that came through in the conversations the members were having, it started in the very first session, or came up from the first session with the chief execs of the providers, and then came through certainly around questions that members were asking in the second session around housing need and specific needs, and was looking at making sure that the allocations policy we have is adhered to by all the registered providers. So that policy is about making sure that those with highest housing need are going to get access to the properties. How do we make sure that that is being adhered to consistently all the way through? Recognising the importance of strategic housing function, we've touched on that already, but again, very much important for us as a council, making sure that that is part of that package of consideration which takes place. So it's being at the table together. Place-based approach to housing and economic development, we've touched on that as well. It's really important that there's a strong link between housing development and the types of housing which are being developed and the economy that we either have in that area and what is required, or from a strategic point of view, what is that going to be developed in an area and what does that housing need to link in. And that is again a strong link into transport and how people are going to access the work and the workspaces. Social housing, rural settlements very much came through in that, and making sure that we're making those links, as it says there, about intergenerational supported housing. So how can we bring together different age groups in communities and make sure that we're working together through those? And it might be that we have carers and their families living in the same communities as the older people, and linking back to that economic perspective as well. Quite clearly, some of what's come through in the conversations is that relationship between a diverse and sustainable and energetic community and the ability to either attract or retain services which are available within them as well. So those different multiplier effects which can occur by having the communities there. And then finally, the council should explore the opportunities to attract funding and lobby for new products. So again, that links into the rural economy, but the idea there being, what can we find as different sources, different routes of either identifying land, bringing more funding in, all of the enablers we might need to have to enable social housing to work through. But fairly quick run through of what was a meaty piece of work. So I think the members who've been involved in it got into the topic very well. The report really it's a report that I've written. It's a report from Scrutiny. But you've got officers from the service area that are online or in the room, and you've got the portfolio holder as well. There's an opportunity to see whether you endorse the report, want to recommend it, whether there's anything you want to add, question, amend, or bring to it, or these particular areas of further work which might need to do there. But back to you, Jo.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone that was involved in the work that was done on this absolutely excellent piece of work, Tom. Well done, and our officers. It's a good report, and as you say, it's very meaty. Dean, would you like to say anything before we start taking questions?
No, only to echo your comments, Chair. Thank you to everybody who was involved and the former chair of the now defunct Communities Scrutiny Committee for kicking this off, Councillor Macy. I think it's a very good piece of work. I think the recommendations are concise enough to be deliverable, but still broad enough to be within scope of policy and strategy rather than operations. So I'll be interested to see what committee has to say, but on the evidence of the paper that's been presented and Daniel's introduction, I welcome the work that's been done.
Sorry, Tom. It's Tom. Not Daniel.
Sorry, is it Tom?
I can't.
I can't see from here. The only people I can see are Roger and Rob, and beyond that, it's a little bit of a blur in the corner. It's a little bit of a blur shrinking. I can see a blaze of pink on the right-hand side, but there's just a blur shrinking away from the screen.
Yeah. Would members like to have recommendations up, or are they quite happy with them not being there? Do you need them on board, do you think? I'd be happy. No? Yes, Roger.
Which recommendations are you going to refer to? The ones in the paper
They are
or the ones
different,
above?
aren't they? Well, I would say the ones in the paper. Yeah, they're a bit, there's a few more words added, but the ones in the paper. Right. If we can kick off then, does anybody have any questions or comments on the paper, Roger?
Thank you, Chairman. Have a number of comments on the recommendations before us.
Yeah.
Don't want to hog the meeting, but it makes no reference about local letting policies or 106 agreements or houses that are in rural areas. Are those in highest need going to overrule if there is not a lettings policy or a 106 agreement there? Are they going to overrule anybody within that parish, I'll say, who lives there? Because it is very limited housing in rural areas, and if we say that it's going to be, it is should ensure that it's adhered to, and it's those in highest need. I recognise those in highest need, but there may be exceptions which need to be made. There's no reference about key worker housing, which is needed. Cross-subsidy housing, there's no reference to it, because cross-subsidy housing could well provide some social housing. And how is that going to be allocated? And also, I've got a comment about 20%. It isn't enough.
Okay,
that's
thank
me
you,
finished,
Roger.
but that's some comments from myself.
Yeah, I think the things you've mentioned are actually mentioned in the report, but who's going to take that, Laura or Jane?
Shall I,
Jane.
shall I kick off? And
Yes,
Mel might want to come in on this as well, because I know she's very much expert. So the key worker, sorry, I'm not doing this in order, but I'm just noticing the key worker aspect falls into the fifth of the five recommendations on here. So what we're looking at is how can we actually secure funding and get new sorts of housing products specifically that support the rural economy, and in particular picking up on key workers who can't at the moment easily access social housing, because typically they're in that category of households whose income would put them out of the reach of social housing typically. They are actually able to apply for social housing and go onto our housing register now, and the new allocations policy coming in does reference key workers as well. So we are trying to pick that up wherever we can, but what they don't have is in terms of statutory housing requirements, as in housing law, that requires the council to prioritise people according to housing need. Your typical key worker wouldn't fit into those categories to get priority for social housing, and that's why this recommendation in relation to key workers is talking about, let's look at other opportunities that we might be able to generate and lobby for other forms of funding, other sorts of housing products, things like shared ownership or rent to buy type products are the sorts of things that might typically be appropriate for the key worker groups, but that would be the focus for that, I would say. In terms of cross-subsidy housing, are you referring to developments that have a combination of market sale homes and affordable housing? Is that what you're?
Yeah. If I can, Chairman, under the planning policies in the process of being adopted, there is the exceptions policy, which is there, everybody knows about, but there is another policy called cross-subsidy, which is pushed by government, in that a piece of land which would not normally be developed, a developer can come forward to put forward, we'll say 5 or 6 market houses associated with 2, 3, 4, whatever, affordable homes, and the money from the market policy houses would cross-subsidise the building of the affordable homes, and that can be on areas outside that would normally get planning permission for, fairly near settlements, etc., all that, but it can use that to cross-subsidise and supply those houses. So those should be subject to some sort of policy, a letting policy, or but they will be available at below the normal market rent.
Can I come in there? Paul Wynne is chairman of the North Planning Committee. Would you like to?
Well, there is a policy there, but yeah, I mean, Gleason's is it? Priest, they put up there, they've got several houses, but there's more the percentage, about 60%, which is affordable.
Yeah.
And it's going on, and they're looking at different places. They're from up north, and they are looking at different ones. Not in the right place sometimes. We've refused a couple, but they are in the wrong place. But they look at another one as well. I know of one in Greece, which is not far from Whitchurch. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Paul. Did you want to come back on that, Jane?
Yes, I understand that, yes, there is an opportunity for cross-subsidy in that way, and that can be effective. I don't think it's going to be significant amounts, but it's still, you know, there may be opportunities where that can come in and provide some support as well. I'm going to call Melon, if I can, at this point, to pick up on the points about local lettings as well that you referenced.
Okay, Mel.
Yeah. So in terms of local lettings policies, and especially those that relate to Section 106 exception sites and potentially cross-subsidy housing where it's outside the development limit, those are referred to in the allocations policy, and there is a link to the allocations policy and scheme on the actual report at the very end of it. We've been slightly delayed in implementing it, no fault of any council staff, I have to I need to say, but it is due to be implemented a week today, and that will be the set policy. So we're moving, as you can see from that, moving to having nominations. So those will be made. Nominations are in line with the council's allocations policy, which includes these local lettings policies. There are a number of those listed. There are more that are out there that we're collating at the moment, but we don't want to delay having the policy implemented for that. But there are a number. So in terms of where there is a local lettings policy, especially if it relates to a Section 106 exception site, that will be in place, and that stipulates that the process it works. So the people in that parish and then cascade it out.
Okay, Roger.
There are some social housing in some parishes which is not subject to a local letting policy, and it's how those, and I was referring to 3.1 in the recommendations in the report. It says to guarantee those in the highest need are allocated housing. And I was picking those on that sentence there, because as I say, in some small parishes there may only be 3, 4, very small number, and if we do not ensure that somewhere in the allocations policy the local connection takes effect, we may denude in that area of local people, bringing people in.
So in terms of housing legislation, which the council has to abide by, otherwise we're at risk of judicial review, the definition of a local connection is to the local authority. So I realise Shropshire is a very large local authority, but that is the legislation. We can only have local lettings policies in particular reasons, and mainly that is because of exception sites or because people are in very high housing need. So we have to recognise the Housing Act 1996 and what it defines as a local connection. But as you'll see from the revised policy, we are ensuring that people have to have a local connection to Shropshire, and in the usual way, and from my experience, where people choose to live is usually where they've got that connection. And so it should be the case that if somebody comes from a particular rural area, that is where they're choosing to bid for homes. But in terms of the connections, the residency requirement is 2 years, or employment or family connection. And the 2-year connection is in line with what is the national recommended residency connection. We have to, by law, again, if people are in what's called a reasonable preference category, and they haven't got a local connection, we have to allow them to register on our list. But you'll see from the policy that those people will be placed in band 7. The only change to this, if somebody, that there is discretion, and I'm sure Laura will be able to explain a bit more about that, but that relates to potentially, for example, if somebody is ex-forces or fleeing domestic abuse, then they wouldn't be required to have a local connection.
Thank you, Mel. You satisfied with your answer, Roger?
Well,
I probably shouldn't
I,
answer.
I haven't seen the revised letting
Okay.
policy, so I don't know. But there's the 20%, which is again is referenced in the report.
Okay.
As it's a housing strategy, could we, and I don't want to do what that scrutiny did, could we suggest that to our planning policy that we would want it higher than 20%? It used to be very much higher, but it was revised down in recent years.
What's the feeling of the committee? Paul, you've dealt with this.
Well, it's between 10 and 20% actually. So,
yeah, it is.
I mean, going back to district days, it used to be 35%.
Yeah.
But it's putting builders off. So there's a balance somewhere. What the right balance is, but to get people, it's opening up land. But if it's out of the areas, it's very difficult unless exception sites, etc. Local need. There's a lot more of those coming through, actually, which does help the situation for local people.
Yeah, I don't think we want to put builders off building, and it becomes too expensive.
It's a difficult one.
Yeah.
Get the market, Roger. Last
one comment. There is a comment in it that many local authorities adjacent to us have a much higher, and so are we attracting builders in? But we are in competition with them, whichever. But if they've got higher ones, then we should try it. And yeah, I understand 10 and 20. It varies between where you are in the county, but it used to be much higher, and we had building going on then.
I believe we have a lot of land. You probably know, Dean, whether this is the case. A lot of land where people have applied for planning permission and haven't actually built. And I suspect it's the cost of building and materials going up and the cost of doing that. So I think 20% personally is very generous.
That's because of the 5-year supply. We were
Yeah.
short 5-year supply.
Yeah.
And we banged the applications in. I reckon only half of them were built, to be fair.
Yeah.
Now they've lost the planning permission and they'll never get it.
No. Gillian.
Can I?
Yeah, sorry, Dean.
Sorry, I just wanted to come in response to some of Roger's questions and statements.
Okay.
In terms of the 20% affordable housing rate, we have to balance overall delivery against affordable housing delivery. The historic performance in overall housing numbers delivery is in line with the needs of the next local plan period. If we were to take action that was to potentially negatively affect overall housing delivery, then we would potentially see annual delivery falling below what we need to do to hit the targets in the emerging local plan that's going to inspectors, was with inspectors at the moment. So I think we need to be very careful. I recognise that there are some local authorities in surrounding areas that do have a higher rate. However, we also have to accept is that Shropshire as a county has a lower overall house price cap, if you like, market rate than somewhere like South Cheshire or parts of Staffordshire and Worcestershire. So it's not quite so straightforward as just to say, well, Cheshire can get away with 30%, so why don't we? When the market there is entirely different. So we always need to have a conscious eye on balancing the needs to deliver affordable housing against the overall needs of delivering all kinds of housing against our agreed local plan policies. The other thing that I wanted to come back on was Roger had said that he hadn't seen the local letting strategy and policy. That went to Cabinet last year, Roger. It went through Cabinet, both for consultation and following consultation last year. So it has been both consulted upon and adopted in the public domain, and it's only the implementation of it that is pending. So it is out there.
Thank you, Dean. Before I come back to you, Julian, I think Laura wanted to say something about what Roger was saying. Or...
No, not specifically. No,
oh,
don't worry.
okay, that's fine. Julian.
Thanks. Yeah, well, number of points. So, I mean, firstly, just on the 40% issue, I think there's some great stuff in here, which is comparison stuff with the Sitfer family. It would have been interesting to include, and perhaps we could look at including just that. You know, across the Sitfer family, what are they looking at in terms of their affordable housing percentages? So
I stop you there. There may be people on this committee don't know what Sitfer is. So the comparative councils, which we seem to sit alongside, which have similar demographics and economic profiles, I imagine, is what they are. Yeah. Do you know what it stands for?
Well, Sitfer is the chart. Flashing green as well. The Sitfer is the Chartered Institute of Public Finance. So it's basically councils, so finance.
I have been to one of their meetings many years ago.
Yeah.
I don't remember what it was.
But Julian's description of the family group is pretty well spot on. Yeah.
Carry on, Julian. Sorry.
That's okay. So yeah, so I'll throw that in there then as a request that we have that comparative data on their percentages. But I have to admit, I'm struggling slightly with this paper, and that's probably because I wasn't a member of the Communities Committee. I was a member of the Place Committee, so a lot of this is unfamiliar. So excuse the ignorance, and also so I'm going to be a bit cynical, which is not typical of me. But my question is, how much will these additional recommendations actually make any difference? Because we can have a housing strategy, but we've also got a local plan which is going through examination and which ties our hands in all sorts of different ways. So I'm just really curious as to how much play there is and how much we can actually do to change the situation. But also part of that, I suppose, is what's interesting is it doesn't go into any detail around what those additional market mechanisms might be. So, for example, community land trusts. So I had an exchange. I've actually had a reply now. We happen to have the chief executive of the Community Land Trust Association living in Shrewsbury, who may well be a useful resource for us to understand what the opportunities are. Because as I understand it, the social housing level, and we do have a real problem with affordable housing because it's not actually affordable for many people, but the sort of social housing level of affordability is being achieved by community land trust building in much of the southwest rather than by what councils are doing, as I understand it. So somebody told me that's hopefully that's correct. So I'm interested in whether we get an opportunity to explore that. I'm rambling a bit. The other one is I get the bit about joining up the strategies, and I just want to push the social care part of that, because I was looking for my sins at the Association of Directors of Social Services documents about good practice, and they absolutely make the point that a big part of the story is finding affordable homes for social care workers and looking for correct homes for moving on people who may or may not be needing social care. So clearly it's a huge part of, with 85% of our budget being spent in those areas, it's a huge part of our story. And are we doing enough to join those things up? The other bit is in terms of the economic strategy. There's in terms of who's doing the development, and this relates back to CLTs. Are we taking the opportunity to approach this in a community wealth building mindset? Are we developing local skills and local know-how and also local wealth in terms of who's doing that development? So I realise that's a whole. Oh, and then finally, another one is, and this is where I do have a pecuniary interest, but nevertheless, I think we as a council need to look very carefully at, as the law changes, at how we can address limiting the growth of temporary let holiday accommodation, which many people feel is cutting into the rented market. We don't probably have the data, so we need to do that. And then we need to look at what policies we can bring through, which will support people getting into the rented market, and that not being undermined by holiday lets, whilst recognising that holiday lets also have a value to the county.
Right, Julian, I can see people feverishly writing and typing, and Laura, you look like you had an answer to something.
Yeah.
thanks for the end question. Can I answer that first, and then I'll come back to Jane and then Mel.
The microphone on, apologies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on points, I suppose 1 and 2 really, in regard to the changes that will make. So an example, I suppose, is currently at the moment, prior to the implementation of the new policy, the registered providers don't actually use our policy. So we have got a policy, but they then have policies in the background if there's things in our policy that they don't like. So clearly that will make a significant difference, because actually they've signed up to use our policy. We've already started having those conversations, and we've seen a significant increase in the number of priority banded, so those statutory homeless individuals that are being moved on into social housing. So by no means perfect yet, but we can start to see that difference. And then I think in regard to point 2, so I can definitely say this probably more than Mel and Jane can. So those of you that have been here for a while know that I have as well. And as much as I've done the work around the operational side of housing, we didn't have a statutory housing function. Jane and Mel have come along, and we absolutely do, in that focus around actually what is it that we need to do, not just the doing on the ground, but what is it that we need to do, both around my world with homelessness, but also around that adult social care piece, that key worker piece. That is the benefit of having that statutory that strategic housing function. So yeah, it's something maybe internally that is recognised more, but some of those conversations they've just got a focus now, I think. Yeah.
Okay. The gentleman you thought it would be good for us all to hear from and speak to. How would we incorporate that, Tom, into this? Because the ideal time would have been before we brought this report, I would have thought.
Well, you are in a position as the committee you are in the position as the committee to say whether or not you accept the report, whether you think and therefore recommending on to cabinet and on to presumably Dean through cabinet as the portfolio holder. You can say whether you think the report's great and it's fine, but it needs a bit more work and we'd like to have some more looks at it. You could turn around and say, thanks, but don't support any of it. We need to do some more work looking at this. So, as a committee, you're in that you have control over that from that perspective. What I think I'm hearing is we're happy with it up to a point, but there might be scope to do a bit more. We'd like to see a bit more evidence to understand what that level was, but it'd be a bit more work. Equally, you could make the report or agree the report and recommend it, and part of what you would be looking for as a response to those recommendations which are accepted is how they would be looked at, and it might be that that's what Mel, Jane, Laura would be doing through Dean in terms of taking that work forward. I suppose it's where do you draw the line and how much do you do the work as a committee, and where does it give part of the response back as well. So you're in a position of power to decide where you want to go to with this as a report and whether you want more work doing on it. We as officers will respond to that, or you can push it forward as something you're happy with, and it's part of how it's responded to in terms of how the recommendations are they accepted, and if they are, what actions are going to be taken. If they're not accepted, what are the reasons why, so you understand.
Okay, well, hang on to that question I just asked then.
But can I just respond to that?
Yeah, I just because you've got two answers to come on to the questions you've not answered yet.
I know.
Yes, okay.
Just so I suppose rather than loading yet more work back on us, sorry, I'm not going to load work on the officers, which doesn't sound fair, does it? But I suppose the easy way around that is simply to say that under the final point that we sort of just put a bit in there to say, and as part of this exploration of other options, we recommend that you talk to community land trusts. I don't think we need to do that. We need our expert officers to do that. And similarly, that we ask officers to investigate options for mitigating the impact of temporary let accommodation on the private rented sector. So I would suggest those as additional recommendations.
And onto the recommendation.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with that. Would everybody be happy with that? I will be. I've got neck waiting if you don't mind.
Well, to reply to that, but
yes, okay. Yeah, we'll try that first. Is everybody happy with what Julian has suggested? You're not, Roger. No. Ted saying no. They're not happy with you, Julian. Okay. No. Okay, Roger. Oh, sorry, I'm going back to Roger just because we're working on this.
Roger can come in first if he wants.
Yeah, you're very kind.
Thank you,
Roger.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks, Nick. No, it's what we're doing here is recommending these 5 points for it, with addition by the officers. Officers, yes, do the work, please. Sorry to load it on you, but to come back here so that we can have a look at it before it goes to scrutiny. I've raised a few issues, and 20%, I don't know, because if one looks at planning applications in Shropshire, the planning committees do alter that 20% anyway, and sometimes have taken it down to 0. And there's open book, there's all sorts. So what sort of target do we want to set at? Is 20% too low a target? I've got a view, others may not agree with it, but it's to come back here as a scrutiny to see if we can add that value to it with the assistance of officers to take it forward.
Can I follow through on that? Because I would normally come to you, Nick, but I just Paul deals with this, so I just want to come back to Paul's.
I've never seen a north one. I've never seen reduced to north, like the north. No, I've been there.
Ironbridge. Ironbridge Power Station site.
Yeah. I'm
taken way down below the 20. Ironbridge Power Station's taken way down below the 20%, and there's been others.
Right. Not as what I am seeing, but fine. Yeah.
Okay. Would you agree to a small working group to look at this before it's moved on? Yeah. I've got Mel as well. It's waiting, but I'll come to you first, Nick.
Thank you, Chair. Under recommendation 3.3, it talks about ensuring housing priorities delivered in the right place, and I wanted to just maybe say a bit more about Councillor Dean's comments about the social care workers, because it does mention in the report about needing to retain young people in rural areas particularly. There's a desperate shortage of carers working in nursing homes and care homes everywhere across the county, and I know a lot of these workers are young because they're quite willing to work 12 hours a day for minimum wage, or if not willing, they don't have a lot of choice. I question about our policy on multi-occupancy dwellings, perhaps because there are some larger buildings that would be quite suitable for converting into houses of multiple occupation which carers could occupy. And a case in point is perhaps the old police station in Ponsonby, which came to planning committee to see if it could be converted into 4 bed-sit apartments, if you like, for carers. And we were pleased to approve it. It actually is very useful. And if you could find more properties like that, i.e. some of the larger properties, which would be quite suitable for converting into carers accommodation, I'm sure that as a policy that would be welcomed by a lot of the rural communities. I know particularly out in the Ponsonby area. And I'll just finish by mentioning that the 1901 census return on my property that I live in stated there were 29 people living in that house. I'm not still it's the same size and now there's 3 of us living in it. But what I'm saying is, I'm not suggesting convert my house. But it would be a good idea. But I just think some of the larger properties would be quite suitable for converting into that sort of premises.
I think I should declare an interest. I've got one of those. Mel, I'll bring you in and then I'm going to go back to the group because I think what we're all saying is it needs a little bit more work on it. We need a small working group to look at it and then bring it back here before we move it on with recommendations. Mel.
It was just to say in answer to Julian's question, how much of a difference, what impact will this make? And I know Laura's talked about the first 2 recommendations. In terms of the last 3, what I would say is we're very much be on the front foot here. We would be going to having a place-based approach is what government policies is moving to at the moment. And also in terms of highlighting the needs of rural settlements and promoting and lobbying for different sort of products. I'm not going to say it's going to happen next week. I haven't got a magic wand, but because of the particular needs of, and this is what we talked about with the workshops, that government policy is quite urban centric at the moment. For us to have that sort of green light to say yes, officers can highlight these issues, put cases together for our funding agencies, and for housing, that is Homes England, and also talking to DLUC, then it will make a difference. As an officer, and things like intergenerational living and so on, and the issues relating to key workers. So we do have that opportunity, but it's important to get that buy-in. And I do think, yes, it's good to do more work on these, but we also need to undertake action as well, because we have to try to influence as much as we can to be able to for the government to recognise the specific needs of rural areas. One example is something like homelessness. There was a report that I think came out last year. I don't think it's necessarily realised those sort of issues do happen in rural areas necessarily. I think quite often things are seen as very urban, but we know the difference. And again, when Tom was talking earlier about homelessness, I'm not talking about street homelessness. And these are people that perhaps in private rented accommodation, families serve notices. So so reiterating, yes, these things will make a difference, but I'm more than happy to do more work with yourselves on them. But it would be good to be given the green light to start doing what we can do in the background. And again, also working with the CLTs. I've helped create one in the past. I've worked with one in another life. But we need to be mindful about the limited funding opportunities that they can access at the moment. And again, that's why we need to be highlighting these issues and getting in to see if we can promote funding streams that could be resurrected. Thank you.
I hear what you're saying, Mel. What you're saying is basically we need to go and move on with it, get something out there as soon as possible. This obviously is going to delay having a small working group. But I would suggest if we do that within the next week or two, one meeting, and then I'm just wondering, do we have to have a full meeting of this committee to agree it? Or can we delegate in some way to some of the members? I must say the officers, because at the end of the day, it's got to be members that have the final say. Julian?
I'm a little confused.
Right.
Because so my suggestion would be that we adopt these recommendations, and we might be adding a few words or something, but that there's a separate piece of work which doesn't prevent these recommendations going forward. Because I absolutely agree with Roger about percentage affordable housing, but a lot of this is not even about build. It's about all sorts of other things. Really interesting point from Councillor Hignett. A lot of this is about what we do with the existing buildings, and so I think that it would be a shame to hold this up whilst we do another piece of work which can be based on looking at the comparisons of affordable rates in other places.
I'll take a vote on this. Whether to go forward with these recommendations and then do further work on it.
Quick one, Chairman, if I can. The next cabinet meeting isn't until September anyway, I don't think, is it?
6th of September, I think.
Yeah, so there is a 7 or 8 week gap anyway between the cabinet.
Yeah, well, my suggestion would be that we take the recommendations forward, and bearing in mind what's being said about the urgency of this, because there is urgency and time will be lost, because you're talking 2 months and then the implementation on top of that. So that's my suggestion. Can I take a vote, please, on taking the recommendations forward that we have here with the slight adjustment that was given by Julian on, I'll come to you in a second, Roger, on bullet point 5. And then we do some additional work aside of that, and then which can add to it. Roger.
Well, thank you, Jen. These, I think, are the recommendations from the previous community scrutiny committee.
It's next, actually,
because there was the workshop there as well, which also did it.
Yeah.
So do they incorporate that? Because it seems to do some, but not all of them. So it's the ones from the member workshop on June the 5th. That's what I'm looking at to
I went to that, we went to that one. So we both went to that one.
Yeah, so I'm trying to incorporate that. Whether we can maybe
and bring it in.
I don't know how to take it forward, but to
I'll let
incorporate some of
Tell
that.
us how we're taking it forward, right? I think voting on my recommendation, on the recommendations is the way forward.
We
Right,
could be
fine.
here a while. Okay, so in terms of what's in the report, yes, it does, Roger, build in what came out of the workshop sessions as well. In terms of options for the next steps, because obviously not my bit. So yes, we take the recommendations forward as they are, and you can have the additional points that have been recognised. So specify community land trusts as a specific example in terms of the innovation, and also in terms of an additional recommendation looking at short-term lets, the impact of short-term lets, and possibly specifying that being a report which comes back to the committee at a point in time. You could recommend that there's a working group set up to look at some of these other factors, which come in. I would say that you really want that working group to, if you set it up in that way, to come back to this committee, to share those points. If, as the chair said, that's done potentially in a way that provides more information but doesn't slow down the recommendations, then that might proceed. The other option is potentially you do what some of you already said, which is look at delegating the final decision on the recommendations to the chair or with the input of other members, possibly through a working group, where they are able to do that work and take those recommendations forward on behalf of the committee to cabinet.
We're making that very complex, though, aren't we, doing it that way?
It's I've seen other committees in the past delegate it, but your that group would basically be would be informing the chair's final recommendations, which go through to cabinet. It's almost.
But it would come here with us before,
No.
or we do delegate
You
it.
delegate it, and
we'd inform all the members as well.
All the members could be informed, but it's that. I mean, most members will have probably seen how that sort of delegated changes can take place. So it's whether or not, as a committee, you want to have that delegation made, or whether you want to, with the recommendations, and have a working group that brings that information back. Taking on board the advice that we've had from the officers who are most in the know about what the impacts and implications could be of slowing it down, slowing down progress.
Right, anybody want to say anything on that? Anybody got strong feelings? Anybody want to support me? Take the recommendations forward and have a small working group that adds to it later? Yeah. Roger.
The allocation policy is going to come in tomorrow. This is the housing strategy. So is the housing strategy paper going to be considered by the cabinet in September?
Dean, come in, please. Dean?
Yeah, the housing allocations policy, which has already been approved, comes into effect next week, not tomorrow.
Well, okay. The housing allocation policy is already there, so we're not going to affect that. This is the housing strategy, so I think there is time to actually look at it. But if we haven't got the time, then delegate it with a chairman and a working group for the chairman to take it forward to September. But I can't understand what going to September as this, what effect it might have on cabinet decisions. If there's no cabinet paper in September, this is just for cabinet to have a look at. I'm not sure where we are with this.
We would take the recommendations to cabinet and hopefully they would pass them and it would set everything in motion. And they'll be working, I assume you'll be working on this in the background between now and then, which speeds up the whole process.
Through you, Chairman, have a delegation working with you to put forward and leave it at that if it does have to go to the September.
Well, everybody, I assume that'd be his opinion. Has nobody got an opinion other than Roger and me? Right, I want to do whatever the quickest, basically, and the quickest will be going forward with recommendations, I assume, and or do we need the working group before those recommendations go forward? Dean looks like he knows the answer. No.
Me, Chair. No, all I was thinking, Chair, was that the earlier this with committee's final thoughts can come to cabinet, the more time that we can spend incorporating any recommendations that committee does want to make to cabinet into the final document before bringing it forward.
Yeah.
That was my only thought on it, but it's entirely in your hands.
You want Rob, so now we're going to make a decision. Because we're passing the back and forth.
I think I get what Roger's main concern is about 20% level of affordable housing in. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's a one particular issue, and the rest of it you're generally okay with.
Yeah.
So is it in that sense? I think
right.
Accepting the recommendations, but having a specific working group to look at that particular planning issue.
I can go with that.
And that means the officer can get work in this 2-month gap.
Thank you, Rob.
Is that okay?
Yeah, everybody happy with that?
Yeah.
Can we take a vote on before Rob just said no? And then, yes, no more. Thank you very much, officers. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Rob. You cut it dead for me. Thank you. Do you want to raise anything before I move on?
No, I think we can. It shouldn't take too long to do that as a piece of research as well. Hopefully, every other local authority's percentage will be fairly easy to find.
Yeah. And there'll be no rush on doing that bit anyway. It's just that small piece. Right. Thank you for that. I feel like I've been playing table tennis with my head. Anyway, we're now going to move on finally to item 7, which is the work programme. Please bear in mind this is a flexible document because of the new way of working with scrutiny. Nothing is set in stone, it can change continuously and evolve. Tom is going to present the work programme, but the Housing Development Test and Finish Group Action Plan, the committee did expect a report back at the next meeting, which is this one, obviously, on the action plan and the progress and impact that has been made to date. The Assistant Director has invited the Chair, that's me, to work with them to help ensure that the action plan and progress reporting is what is required. It was initially going to be at this meeting, but due to work pressures and everything, it will now come to the next one. So if you want to go through the work programme, Tom.
Okay, so I think most of you, if not all of you, were able to be involved in both of the work programming sessions that we did. So the first one was about what are the topics, and the second one was starting to work through some of what you wanted to achieve by looking at the topics. What we've got on here is, although it says 23-24, these are the meaty topics, the substantial topics. These are the topics which I think would lead into investigations, so task and finish group pieces of work, or it would be topics where maybe you're going to look at it as a whole committee outside of the formal committee meeting, start to be clear about the types of questions and things you want to look at, and then be inviting witnesses to come to a meeting of the committee. So if you looked at one now and said you wanted that approach, the meeting on the 9th of November might have that as the main one of these topics. Developer contributions, for example, at the meeting, and you would be asking questions of the witnesses to get to the evidence that you require. So part of what today is really starting to look through this and being able to sort of pick which of the topics are the ones which you might want to bring forward and look at, and really how to do it. So I know I've picked developer contributions there as a out of the list and sort of bring it to the meeting. It might be that that's best done looking at that through a task and finish group and looking at that and taking account of all of the different things which are happening and changing in relation to that. And for that one in particular, the conversation that you had was not so much about the levels and the distribution of local contributions. It was more about, are all of the stakeholders in communities who are asked to contribute to and identify whether what a local contribution needs to go towards, doing that and doing it in a robust way. So I think the example that was given in the work programming sessions was, are the GP practices in the areas where developers are going to be looking to build, identifying the level of demand that's going to be taking place, and whether or not that needs to be better worked up and more understood, so that developer contributions better reflect what's required. So that was very the meat of that. So that's why I'm suggesting that one might be a task to finish group, because you'll want to explore topics in a different way. So really, again, I don't think you want to go through this. There shouldn't be any surprises in this and what's here, but it's an opportunity for you to sort of pick through these and say which of these do you want to go with first, and we can discuss how best that work can be carried out. The only one I guess that might come through on this one was the timing around the climate change. Just trying to see if I can split it on there. That might be towards the top, I think. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. It's just where it's that time of climate change, and as the annual report comes out, and how you want to flow on from that. But I've spoken enough today. So,
any comment? Anyone say anything? Yes, Roger.
Developer contributions, but it's to do with developers. I've been approached by 2 or 3 different councillors about developments and the adoption of roads into the council. Section 38, I think, if my memory serves me right, and the delays that occur. Now, whether that could be incorporated in that developer contributions, because whether they contribute a fixed sum or whatever, but as time goes on, if there's anything needed on those roads when they are adopted, who pays? The developer who left that estate 2 years ago or not? I don't know. And there seems to be some delays occurring to it. So whether it's developer contributions, whether that become part of it or not, I'm not sure. I did bring it up at the audit this morning, and the audit committee said it's more scrutiny than audit. So I'm just saying that could that maybe be tacked onto that to make it a little bit wider when we're talking to developers, to bring that in there.
Okay, Dean, do you mind me asking? I don't know what you were thinking then, but you were definitely showing expression on your face. I did that way. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I just. Yeah.
No, I was just thinking, Chairman, that I've had 1 or 2 similar examples to Roger over the years that have caused frustration. Any expression on my face was just reminiscing about some of those.
Okay, thank you. I think we've all had those issues. But is that the right place to be looking at this, or is that something separate? I suppose is my question for officers. It's 2 different things, but it is a huge issue.
From the perspective of the work programme, we can look at how that can be woven into it. It might be one of those pieces which you look at it and you go, actually, that is a separate piece of work. It would benefit from being looked at separately. But perhaps we need to look at it to understand, because the question in there that Roger posed, which was who or how is the cost of any remedial action covered as a result of that, and how does that relate to developer contributions? Is I don't know the answer, but it suggests there could be a link to explore, even if it gets sort of recommended as an online piece of work.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's reputational to the council, because we get a really bad name when it's not the council's fault, because the council are waiting for the roads or the footpath to be brought up to standard, but people automatically think it's Shropshire Council. So yeah, reputationally, I think there's something going on there. We'll have a look at that, shall we?
I shall weave it into that.
That's great.
That piece, yeah.
Yes, Julian.
Can I just ask about the witnesses column? Are these sort of general suggestions, and you want us to give you a steer on who we want to hear from, or are you going to see who can turn up?
Julian, as your number 1 fan here, I'm going to say, who do you want there?
Well,
Okay, put me on the spot now. But I mean, for example, under the climate change one, it doesn't mention zero carbon Shropshire, for example, who I think are our partner on that. So it would be good to have them in the room. Definitely be good to hear from March's Energy Agency on the whole sort of retrofit story and where that's at in the county. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear from the passenger transport group or somebody around the sort of modal shift story from a passenger point of view or from a community point of view. Just for example, I didn't expect to get asked that question.
And it's the way I put it. Yeah. Anybody else anything to say on it? No, Rob, you look like you might have wanted to say something. You want to go home, really, don't you?
No, that's okay.
He's going somewhere.
Just, as again, as same as you, off the top of my head on transport, I know that there's a number of consultants working on transport at the moment. If we get someone in from those consultants, for example, I know Phil Jones Associates is doing some work, so potentially Phil Jones, who's the chairman of that, or someone else to speak about that, I think would be very useful when that comes up.
But committee members can email you with suggestions of who we might want to talk to us if they want to talk to us.
I mean, what I would say on this is the work programme based on the conversations that we had. Absolutely, this is not died in stone. This is it. This is where it's going to be. This is the guide for the next 24 months in terms of topics. As Joyce said, it is live. It can adjust. If new things come up, they can be moved. We can take stuff off. What's really important that you do is you are able to, from this, so what's the piece of work? So part of this is what's the piece of work you want to commission? We're going to, you want to do. So you want to do it as a task and finish group. I can then write it out to all members and ask who would like to be part of the task and finish group, just like we've got some of the live ones going at the moment. To pick up Julian's specific point then, for doing it as a task and finish group, it's the task and finish group that will confirm its terms of reference. This might broadly set it out. And as part of that, it will be the task and finish group which confirms who they want to speak to and about what as well. So as some of you will be experiencing through some of the work you're doing at the moment, that's absolutely how this has to work. So I guess the question ultimately as we work through this will be, where do we want to start?
Yeah. Paul, then Rob.
Hey, Chair. Yeah, just Rob and Julian brought up about highways looking into it, etc. I think it might have an impact on the Northern Planning Committee. Anybody who's discussing that, I think we know what we're talking about. Don't you think, Chair?
I guess.
You've got to be very careful.
Oh, I know. Yes.
As usually. So
yeah.
I'd say Shirehall as well.
No.
Yeah. I think what we were talking about is something slightly different to. I thought. Anyway, Rob.
What I was going to suggest was essentially for Tom to give Tom a steer going forward. So we're talking about a meeting in November. If that were to be a meeting in November on developments, where we're talking about, so adoption of roads and those issues and developer contributions, would a way forward be to set up two task and finish groups separately to look at those two things ahead of our meeting in November? They can then report to me in November, and then we can actually do whatever we need to do with those, so that the task finish groups do the work ahead of the scrutiny meeting, and then the scrutiny meeting then looks at this. Is there time? I think there is before November to do that, and they're two jointish topics, so the witnesses may be similar.
Firstly, spot on in terms of the way that the task and finish groups work and how they would complete their work and then report back. Now they can report back and do the report to today and make recommendations. In fact, that's what I would hope that they would do, and there'll be all the evidence there which backs it up. As a committee, then you receive that, you decide whether or not you're going to be accepting those reports and whether you want to put them on, or whether there's more work that you want to do, or as today, a bit of a conversation discussion that pulls it together, and you might change the recommendations or add to the recommendations before they go forward. In terms of time to do the work, depending on what gets scoped and how that looks, yes, there's probably time to do the work. It'll come down to capacity, both for the members and for the officers who are doing it. So if it's me supporting it, as the scrutiny officer in this instance, it's another bit of work that I'll be doing on top of some of the other bits and strategic development in there. So it's that balance. It could be, as you said, two separate task and finish groups, or they could be together. That's the bit we were talking about before that we're not quite sure on. But the fact that they're both about developers does suggest a link.
Yeah, and we have at the moment got the water quality group that's still running. So I see we have quite a few diary invites for those who are involved. Rosemary, haven't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
One or two.
No. So, do you want to see whether we can fit them both in? Because you say it makes sense.
If that's the one we want to go with first, for example, as a committee, so you want to go with first as a committee, I'll have a look at the terms of reference and how they could be done as one, and we can start the ball rolling. We can aim for the 9th of November. I think if it takes longer than the 9th of November to do it for whatever reason, we can bring an interim report back. But picking up what Mel said earlier, we get the ball rolling. We actually start doing the work. We're not going to try and we're not waiting for it to be 100% right before we start. We might as well get on with it.
Is everybody happy with that? Yeah. Julian, stop saying no. Because we're going to vote and you'll be outnumbered.
Well, I'm trying to get my head around this. So, because those are task and finish groups, but you suggested that the climate change one is a whole committee piece. I'm trying to work out where the options are for. I mean, so the case for dealing with that is that we've now had 2 annual reports, and neither of them have come to scrutiny. The second one said there's actually an uptick in our CO2 emissions, and also made the point that part of the problem is that we're not getting information from right across the organisation. There's quite a lot of stuff to look at there from a scrutiny point of view, and it's sort of urgent.
So you think that's more urgent than looking at housing and the side of things? Well, we'll take a vote on this, okay? We'll take a vote on this. It's a democratic thing to do.
Can I just ask you, when does the next report come out? What's the timing of the next? When did the last one come out? Just remember.
This one's not been out too long. It was meant to be out in December 22. Sorry.
Okay, carry on, Rosalie.
Yeah, but it was late delivering, wasn't it? So I suspect it'll probably be spring of next year.
In which case, that's the time to look at it, really.
That would be then number 3. We haven't looked at number 1 or number 2 yet.
Yeah, but you want that up-to-date information, don't you? I'll take a vote on it. It's democratic. Everybody's happy to look at the housing development side and do a task and finish group on that. Can I have a vote, please? Could you put your hand up? Right, sorry, you're outvoted there, but we will put the climate change stuff on as the next thing that we do, which is flexible.
So yeah, I'll catch up with Julian and just sort of get a bit of a handle on what some of the questions are he's thinking about, because we might be able to bring a bit more to the meeting in November as well.
That's fine. Yeah, I'm happy to be in on that meeting if you like. If that's of any help, Julian. Okay. So nothing else to say about the work programme. I talked to press. Remember that the real meat, I keep using that word, of the committee now is actually in those task and finish groups and what comes out of them. So please remember that.
What's November date? Sorry,
November, 9th of November. So the date and time of the next meeting is Thursday, the 9th of November at 2 o'clock. And thank you all very much. I think that was a little bit painful in places, but especially for Dean.
Just to stop the live event.
Yeah, that's fine.